All right, let's try this once more. Doug has advised us that we should tell you all to turn the volume up at home if you can. And we're gonna do the best that we can here. So first and foremost, thank you all for participating in today's demand management workshop. This is intended to be for the work groups to sort of apprise the work groups of what they're going to be working on, how the different processes are going to unfold, and how this is going to go. But we're also going to do some going over of some of the background on the river, and Director Mitchell is going to cover that in more detail. Just for everyone's information, we are going to have questions at the end of the webinar, but we're going to ask everyone to do that via the chat box. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you know, just kind of write those down or hold on to them, and at the very end of the webinar, we'll take those through the chat box. Once again, I just want to thank everybody from Colorado Water Congress for hosting the webinar and helping us through our growing pains into this new and exciting technology. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Director Mitchell for the background.
Thank you all for attending. I wanted to start out with that. And then also I wanted to thank everyone for actively participating in all of these discussions as we plan for Colorado's water future. Some of the key elements that we're going to be discussing today. First, we'll do a brief background on the Colorado River. We're keeping it brief because a lot of this has been discussed in previous presentations, and so we'll get right to the meat of the discussion, talking about demand management feasibility investigation, how we got there, and why the CWCB board is directing us to do this investigation. Also, I just wanted to give a little reminder that it is not a foregone conclusion that we'll be doing a demand management program within the state of Colorado, but this is the feasibility investigation component. So we'll also then move into the logistics and work group activities, and we're going to spend a lot of time there. There's a lot of interest in that, and we want to make sure that we get all those questions answered. And that is just a reminder to keep your questions, and you can put them in the chat box. We'll filter through those, and we're going to leave plenty of time for questions and discussions at the end of the presentation. So thank you all again for attending.
Hi, my name is Lane Leoniak, and I'm an Assistant Attorney General in the Interstate and Federal Waters Unit. And so I'm here to give a little bit of context and background on the Colorado River. This map is very familiar to most, if not all of you, but I think it's always good to have a reminder that we are but one state that depends upon the Colorado River as a reliable source of supply. There are literally millions of others that are in the same position, both located geographically within the basin itself and outside of the basin. And its headwaters do start in Rocky Mountain National Park, and it does flow approximately 1,400 miles to Mexico. 40 million people rely on this water. 5.5 million acres of irrigated ag depend upon this water. The river flows through several national parks and monuments and drives about a $1.4 trillion economy annually. The Law of the River, these three documents certainly are not the entirety of the Law of the River. There are lots of documents and agreements that make up that body of law, but these are the three most important for our purposes when talking about DCP. So the first is the Colorado River Compact. That gave exclusive beneficial use of 7.5 million acre feet to the upper basin, and then an additional 7.5 million acre feet to the lower basin, plus an additional 1 million acre feet to the lower basin for additional development and consumptive use. The compact also calls for a non-depletion obligation, that the upper basin does not deplete the flow at Lee Ferry below 75 million acre feet over a 10-year consecutive period. The Upper Colorado River Compact of 1948 is the agreement that was reached between the upper basin states. We do provide 50,000 acre feet every year to Arizona, and then the remainder is divided up in the form of percentages among the upper basin states. And that percentage is a portion of the available supply in any given year. So for instance, Colorado has 51.75% allocated to it under the compact. If we have a full supply of 7.5 million acre feet, then Colorado is entitled to in excess of 3.8 million acre feet of that. If in a given year we have something less than the 7.5 million, then it's 51.75% of whatever that available supply is. The last document is the 2007 interim. Oh, one other thing I want to mention is that the 1948 compact created the Upper Colorado River Commission, and they are tasked with determining if it should be found that the upper basin is out of compact compliance. Then UCRC is tapped with determining to what extent and what needs to be replaced from the various states to return us to compact compliance. The last document is the 2007 interim guidelines. That calls for shortage sharing amongst the lower basin states, and really primarily Arizona and Nevada. As I'm sure you're all aware, they are incentivized to conserve water in Lake Mead through something called intentionally created surplus. And the guidelines also call for the coordinated reservoir operations of Lakes Powell and Mead. So instead of treating them as two separate units, to operate them more as a single unit. The guidelines have worked as intended. However, we've had some very challenging hydrology for the last 19 years. We've technically been in drought during that time. When you look at the average inflow into Lake Powell between April and July is in excess of 7 million acre feet, and the inflows into Powell in 7 of the last 18 years have been below 5 million acre feet. That's a difficult thing to overcome. That said, we have not been out of compact compliance. We've never been in a curtailment situation. In fact, our average 10-year release or flow at Lee Ferry has been in excess of 92 million acre feet. Some of you might be wondering, why are we sending 92 million plus acre feet down when technically we really only owe them or cannot deplete to the tune of about 75/10. And the reason for that is because in 2011, we had a very good big water year. And under the guidelines that called for an equalization release. So in excess of 13 million acre feet was released from Lake Powell to go to the lower basin. That data point is going to fall off in 2021. And when that happens, that's going to drop our 10-year consecutive average down to about 83 to 85 million acre feet. So we have much less wiggle room when that data point drops off. So because of this challenging hydrology and despite the fact that we haven't been in compact compliance, reservoir elevations have continued to drop. And so the basin states and the federal government felt as if it was necessary to begin to plan for what we would need to create a bridge and to create some space in order to allow the parties to get to 2026 when the interim guidelines expire. So they began with this interstate drought contingency planning process. What is it? It is a short-term drought response planning process to reduce risks associated with reaching critical elevations in Lake Powell and Mead. And in Powell, that is an elevation determined by reclamation to be 25 feet above sea level to create a sufficient buffer above that minimum power pool of 3490. One of the goals here is to be proactive instead of reactive when responding to drought. It's great we've never been out of compact compliance. It's also something we've never done before, and we believe would inject a fair degree of uncertainty into water management decisions throughout the basin. So we're trying to sit down and agree to how we could mitigate or avoid risks associated with the compact curtailment. And in doing so, we're hoping to create additional flexibility within the law of the river, within the set parameters, while still creating certainty for water managers going forward so that they know, all right, this is what we're going to do when this happens. We also believe that this allows us, particularly in the upper basin, to control our own destiny. Unlike the lower basin, where the Secretary of the Interior is the special master and water users have to contract directly with reclamation for releases out of Lake Mead, we have agreed to allocate water via a compact between the states. If we are unable to demonstrate that we have control of our own affairs, we're concerned that the federal government would step in and do that for us. And we do believe that we are the best situated to make those decisions. We also want to avoid unilateral and uncoordinated efforts that could lead to conflict or litigation. So what is the DCP? It is a suite of documents that were executed on May 20th of this year. They're comprised of the Lower Basin DCP, which has some fairly, because they have the luxury of having Lake Mead directly above them, there's some pretty detailed provisions in their agreements. They also have intrastate agreements because, as again I mentioned, Secretary of the Interior is the special master, so their water users have to contract directly with Reclamation, and they're agreeing to conserve specific amounts of water as a part of this plan. So that's why they have those intrastate agreements. And then we have the Upper Basin DCP, which consists of the Drought Response Operations Agreement and the Demand Management Storage Agreement. And Amy Asik is going to walk you through that here in a minute. These are all tied together by the companion agreement that sets forth the terms and conditions of how the parties are going to interact with each other, including but not limited to consultation and notice provisions. This has been blessed by federal legislation. The Lower Basin sought federal legislation in order to be able to have the flexibility to take water out of Lake Mead when they otherwise wouldn't be able to under the 07 guidelines. And then the Upper Basin wanted the federal legislation to enable them to have that placeholder in Lake Powell for available storage space when and if a Upper Basin demand management program was ever developed. The Lower Basin DCP also triggers Minute 323 to the 1944 treaty with the Republic of Mexico that triggers shortage sharing provisions for Mexico to leave some of their allocation in Lake Mead as well. So this Lower Basin DCP, it's basically goes above and beyond the intentionally created surplus that the 2007 guidelines established to incentivize the Lower Basin states, including California, to put additional intentionally created surplus, leave more water in Lake Mead. It also brings Reclamation to the table. They've agreed to contribute about 100,000 acre feet of savings. And the incentives for the Lower Basin is really primarily increased flexibility as to when they can access that water at a later date. In terms of sustainability planning, this does not solve the structural deficit, and we in the Upper Basin, when we refer to the structural deficit, we mean when the Lower Basin is using more than its allocation. So this is not a solution for that. This is a bridge, a Band-Aid. It's a short-term solution to allow the states to work together to develop longer-term fixes. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy Asik.
Thanks, Lane. So my name is Amy Asik. I'm with the Federal and Interstate Unit at the Attorney General's Office. I've probably met many of you on the line. And before I jump into the Upper Basin DCP, maybe it's a good time just to check really quick that we're good on technology, volume issues. Great, yeah. Okay. So Lane talked a bit about the Lower Basin elements of the DCP, and as you recall, there are also some Upper Basin elements. But just first to kind of decipher, sorry about that, the Upper Basin DCP from the Lower Basin DCP, as Lane discussed, in the Lower Basin DCP, the Lower Basin states are agreeing to take specific cuts under different circumstances. In the Upper Basin, what we're really doing is planning. We're not taking specific cuts at this point. We are just planning for additional flexibility in the system moving forward. So when we talk about the goals of the Upper Basin DCP, one is to ensure that Lake Powell is protected against reaching those critical elevations. And we also want to continue make sure that the 2007 guidelines continue as they were meant to continue. Like Lane said, they have worked as they're supposed to, but given the challenging hydrology we've had, we needed a little bit something extra to ensure that the reservoirs are staying at above those critical levels. And with the Lower Basin DCP, the goal is to kind of achieve some synergistic benefits for the system as a whole. So the Upper Basin DCP, there are a couple of elements to it that we're going to talk about today. One is the Drought Response Operations Agreement, and the other is the Demand Management Storage Agreement. And we're here today to talk about demand management, so we'll spend a bit more time on that aspect. But the Drought Response Operations Agreement, just briefly, calls for the coordinated operation of the upper basin reservoirs so that we can, again, protect those target elevations at Lake Powell. Everything is within the existing environmental compliance. So it's just operating the reservoirs in ways that we're already legally allowed to do so to add some additional protection to the system. So the Demand Management Storage Agreement, again, that's kind of where we're going to be spending a little bit more time today talking about the feasibility investigation. But what the demand management storage agreement does is really set up the framework for us to just begin the discussion about demand management. It does not set up a demand management program. It doesn't certify or anything that we're going to have any kind of demand management program. But it gives the upper basin states the ability just to begin that discussion and to talk about what it might look like. And we're going to get into that a little bit more as we go forward. And just to be clear, legally, what the demand management storage agreement does is it gives us space in Lake can be used in a potential demand management program if one is ever set up in the upper basin. Again, there's no guarantee that we're going to use that storage capacity. We don't know yet what a potential demand management program might look like, but it just gives us the ability to use that if we get to a point where it is feasible. So, just to begin, talking about demand management and what it actually is, we figure we should start with the definition before kind of delving in more to it. So the idea of demand management is being explored pursuant to a couple of Upper Colorado River Commission resolutions in 2014 and 2018 to explore the feasibility of temporary, voluntary, and compensated reductions and diversions to conserve water that would otherwise be consumptively used. And the whole goal here is to help avoid the need for involuntary curtailment of Colorado River uses. So we're really looking at compact compliance with this water. And now I'm going to hand it over to Karen Kwan, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the interstate efforts surrounding demand management.
Hi, everybody. Just to go into the demand management storage agreement a little bit to parse that out so that, as Amy had indicated, it provides the foundation for us to be able to have a demand management discussion in a way that we would at least be comfortable with investigating. There's two parts to the demand management storage agreement that comprises part of the DCP, the Drought Contingency Plan. It's the authorization for demand management storage water to be stored in the initial units of the CRISPAC. So that's Lake Powell, the Aspinall Unit Blue Mesa, Flaming Gorge, and Navajo reservoirs. And then, so there's an authorization for that, and then there's an agreement among the parties of how we can access that storage that's been authorized under a demand management program. The authorization is what was federally approved and recognized, and it doesn't expire. So now we're able to use those initial units, the Blue Mesa, Flaming Gorge, Navajo, and Lake Powell. We can actually store water that was conserved for the specific purpose of compact compliance, maintaining compact compliance so long as it's under a demand management program and it's driven by the Upper Colorado River Commission asking it to be released for compact compliance. Those are kind of the authorization sideboards for this type of storage. But how do we actually get to access that storage is defined by the agreement, and the terms of the agreement itself are the minimum requirements of what would need to be in a demand management program if we ever have one that would help to drive how the facilities would be operated and the water would be created and conserved. And some of those, that's a limited time frame. Those minimum requirements exist through now, between now and the end of the 07 guidelines, and they'll likely become the topic. They'll either be continued through or become a topic of negotiations when the 07 guidelines are renegotiated. But again, you have the authorization and then you have the agreement, and the agreement kind of dictates what we can do and the sideboards of how to develop a program if we wanted to. And that agreement has broken down into very cursory terms as 4 elements to it. The agreement has a feasibility phase, a development of demand management program phase. We have to reach agreements with the Secretary of the Interior, and then we have to have our own set of approvals. We have to go, and it's prudent that we have to go through a feasibility analysis. Nobody knows if demand management is a good idea. Nobody knows what it would look like, how it would be a good idea, and whether it's helpful or not. So we have to go through this feasibility assessment. And in that, we have to look at how we would verify and account for the water that's created, how it would be shepherded or moved from where it's created to where it needs to go, how it's stored and released, how it's funded, and whether it can be compliant with existing laws, not only in Colorado, but in Wyoming and Utah and New Mexico and the federal government. So that's the feasibility phase, and that's what we're in right now. If we get to a point where we reach consensus that there is a possible way that it could be feasible, then we actually have to go through the process of developing the program itself. So we have a whole nother phase to go through after looking at feasibility. And the demand management development phase would have to look at what the minimum requirements are. For example, for water conservation, under the agreement requirements under the storage agreement, for example, the water must have been beneficially and consumptively used in years prior and would have been used but for participation in the program. It would need to be conveyed through an initial unit to where it needs to go. It would need to be subject to evaporation limits. There's a maximum storage capacity of 500,000 acre feet between now and 2026. Those kind of things are the things that we would definitely need to build into the development of a program, plus all the things that we learn in a feasibility analysis that we think are important to protect, promote, and avoid. And then with that, we have a program potentially, but that doesn't mean, just because we have a program, we still have to reach agreement with the Secretary of the Interior on how that program would be implemented through the facilities, the federal facilities. And in doing that, there's a prerequisite that we consult with the Lower Basin and that the Secretary of the Interior consult with the Lower Basin on those terms. And then after that, depending on how that all lands, then we have to have the Upper Colorado River Commission make a finding that demand management is needed. So we would trigger this. The Upper Colorado River Commission would need to approve the program officially, and so would the state commissioners of each upper division state. So that's the process to even before we have a program that's implementable. And that's what the concept of the demand management storage agreement is trying to outline. So while we are doing the initiating today and in recent days, initiating this whole investigative process within Colorado, it's not Colorado by themselves that can stand up a demand management program or determine whether it's feasible or not. We have to work with and should work with the other upper basin states and under Upper Colorado River Commission. So through that, the Upper Colorado River Commission is embarking on looking at these issues from an upper basin level, coordinating between the states and looking at issues that we all need to address. And again, each state is looking within their own boundaries of what it would look like for, what feasibility looks like for demand management, each of their boundaries for issues that are unique to them or very important to them. And then we have an ongoing effort for coordinating among the states and the federal government while we're looking at this.
All right, so Karen and Amy and Lane gave a really good overview of the drought contingency plan in both the upper and lower basin. And what I'd like to do right now is sort of narrow the focus a little bit from the entire upper basin or the entire Colorado River Basin to what's happening within Colorado, which is why you all have tuned into this webinar today. The Water Conservation Board is leading this investigation of demand management. That first box that Karen had on her slide of the feasibility of demand management, deciding whether or not it's a good idea and seeing what some of the biggest roadblocks are to potential implementation. That's what we're doing right now. And Director Mitchell made the point at the beginning of the webinar that a demand management program is not a foregone conclusion. We haven't decided yet whether or not it's appropriate, whether or not it's feasible, or whether it's not something that makes sense in Colorado and throughout the upper basin. So to that end, the Water Conservation Board has taken two big policy statements, I think, or two big steps towards investigating the feasibility. The first, adopted last November, right after the DCP documents were released for public review, was the CWCB's policy and support statements. These statements did a couple of different things. First, they expressed the Water Conservation Board's support for the DCP documents in the upper and lower basins in that draft form in early October. And then they set some sideboards on how we were going to investigate demand management within the state of Colorado. These sideboards and these guidelines were based very heavily on our work with the Basin Roundtables and through some of the public outreach we've done to that point. They were based on our work with the various water policy boards, stakeholders, and water users around the state. And they said that if we're going to investigate a demand management program, if we're going to start looking at this technically, legally, from a policy perspective, here is how we're going to do it. We're going to do it in this way that's voluntary, temporary, and compensated. We're going to investigate it in a way that seeks to avoid negative disproportionate impacts to any water use or any geographic sector of the state. And these are the sideboards on how we're going to investigate it. And you, the different work group volunteers, are going to help us do that. The second big movement that our board took in assessing this feasibility of demand management was the 2019 work plan, which was approved by our board in March of this year. The 2019 work plan is an idea of what we think we can accomplish within one fiscal year and getting some steps on the path to just this investigation of feasibility, determining whether or not it's the right thing to do. This isn't saying that by the end of 2020 or 2021, we think we're going to have an answer to yes or no, demand management is appropriate for Colorado and the Upper Basin. This is us just taking this one step at a time and starting to identify those threshold issues, the big questions that have to have an answer before we say, yes, we'd like to pursue demand management in a more meaningful fashion. The work plan has a few different elements. I'm going to go through those in some more detail. But first and foremost, it's to start identifying those threshold issues that would be associated with implementing a demand management program in Colorado. And it's to start tackling this complicated array that Karen started to get at, the funding question, the shepherding question, how this is going to be administered within the prior appropriation system, which is that bedrock of Colorado water policy. All these questions that demand management raises and the ways that people see opportunities and challenges that demand management would present within Colorado, we have to start framing those issues, not only for our board, but for all the different stakeholders and water users around the state of Colorado. Next, there you go. So the 2019 work plan has three big elements. One of those is the continued education and outreach. Colorado is blessed with this amazing stakeholder and public forum for water policy. We have the Basin Roundtables, we have the Interbasin Compact Committee, and we have a series of very engaged and informed water users and stakeholders across the state, the water policy boards, the different utilities, the different NGOs who work on water policy. So when you already have this good system, why fix what's already broken? So why fix something that isn't broken? So we're going to continue to do the outreach to the Basin Roundtables, the IBCC, and the different water policy boards that we've been doing since January of last year. Thanks for the support, everybody. We're going to do a series of public workshops. We're going to do these around the state in different locations so that people can come, get informed of how the work group process is unfolding and how far we've come in between each workshop. And then finally, we have formed these work groups, which you all have signed up for and volunteered your time. And for the first of many times, thank you so much for helping us out with this process. As we've said a couple of times, it would have been easy, well, not easy, but a little more efficient maybe if the five of us sitting up here sat in our offices and we came up with what the threshold issues are for demand management and what questions have to be answered first. But that would not present a very full picture. And frankly, I think it would waste some of the time of this valuable stakeholder and public input forums that we have if we came to the public, to the water policy boards without a more honed down, better first stab at demand management questions and investigative ideas. So how are the work groups going to work? And Amy and Karen and I are going to sort of tag team this one. The purpose and the role of the work groups. As with everything on the Colorado River, it's important to point out what things are and what they aren't. The work groups, as I just mentioned, we're sort of extending our table and we're saying, come help us at the project management team phrase these concepts around demand management in a way that we can take to our public stakeholder forums and have a meaningful, informed discussion. Not a piece of information here or a concept here, but the full picture of how demand management is being investigated so that when we do have this public discussion, it's informative, people know what they're talking about, and then we have all the ideas pretty well fleshed out for people to wrap their hands around. This is also to frame for the public discussion and for our board, this discussion about demand management. The work groups themselves, as you all know, are subject matter experts, folks who have volunteered their time to help us expand our table of staff here and start phrasing these issues in a way that are good for public discussion. As we go through the process and as we go through this fiscal year experiment and this work plan, the information, the discussion that these groups are having is going to be a big part of the public discussion coming out. And Karen's going to walk a little bit through more, I think, some of the reporting out that we're going to do from these work groups and how this is going to happen. And again, as I mentioned before, the purpose of these work groups is to help frame these issues and start to wrap our heads around how we can investigate these important threshold issues in a way that we can set the stage for that meaningful public discussion down the road. This is going to be led by the project management team, which all five of us up here are part of. This is a group of folks from the Attorney General's office, from the Water Conservation Board staff, from the Executive Director's office over at DNR, and from the Division of Water Resources. And to the extent that we have some interstate discussions, Colorado's commissioner to the UCRC. We sort of see the project management team being analogous to the role that the CWCB played in the formation of Colorado's water plan. We're the curators. This is a clearinghouse of information. We're the ones who are going to try to put the ideas and the concepts and some of the maybe answers to these difficult questions in a way that people can digest. We're going to help identify and frame those primary issues that our board and the public water forums need to know to be considered and to have this informative discussion of demand management. We're going to work with the Interstate Commissioner and the Upper Colorado River Commission as they have those parallel interstate conversations. And we're going to be working very closely with the work groups, with the folks who run these work groups, and with the staff facilitators that we have from the project management team. I'm going to pass this over to Amy Asik to talk a little bit more about the logistics of the work groups.
Thanks, Brent. So since this is demand management work group orientation, you're probably wondering how this is all actually going to play out. So Brent did a pretty good job of going over a lot of the substantive goals and what we're really doing here. As far as the actual logistics of the meetings go, we're hoping that each work group will meet 4 times between now and June 30th, 2020. There are going to be facilitators for each group, which you're probably already aware of, and they'll kind of guide these discussions. And we're really hoping that these meetings can be in-person meetings, but you know, we have talked about making other options available if we need to, like webinars like this. And attendance is really important. You know, if we're only going to have 4 meetings, we really want enough time to really dig into these important issues. So Brent really covered a lot of these substantive goals for the work groups. They're really kind of framing these threshold key issues that are related to demand management. There are a lot of really kind of tricky, thorny issues out there, and we're hoping that you all can help us identify the opportunities, the risks, the challenges, all of that stuff. And we do anticipate that maybe some work groups will work with contractor for certain projects. So it's possible that your group will be developing a scope of work for a contractor, and we can talk about that a little bit more as we go. And again, the specifics will kind of depend on the particular work group. You're each going to be charged with looking at a different realm of issues. So your needs and your trajectory will kind of depend on that scope of work that you have. Like I said, each group will be kind of led by a facilitator, and this facilitator is going to coordinate the meetings for you. They will provide information on the time and place and stuff like that, and they'll also guide the discussion, and they'll track those discussions for the project management team. And they'll work closely with the project management team on the next steps of the investigation. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Karen to talk about some document and information management issues.
Hi. So a number of you guys, or all of you guys, have received a ground rules document and a disclosure agreement. So let's just cut to the chase here a little bit. We understand that the whole point of the work groups is to generate some information to identify what the threshold questions are, identify how we potentially can investigate them, and that's the kind of information we need to discuss with the public. So how are we going to do that? The documents that are created in the work group process will not have any attribution to any individual person within CWCB, within our office, within the work group itself. The goal is to have frank discussions where we can brainstorm and identify things so that we can really get the full breadth of the information that Brent was talking about framed, so we can have a real meaningful discussion with the public. Now, so the documents and the preparation generated as part of the work group process will be subject to the limited disclosure agreement. That's part of the packet that you guys have received. This disclosure agreement is important for us for a number of reasons, and it's not because we want to try to control the information and only dole out what we want. That is not the goal. Our goal has been and continues to be as transparent as possible so that we can have a meaningful discussion with the public. The CWCB is the one, as Brent had identified, is the one who's undertaking this effort on behalf of the state. They need to know what's being discussed and how the information is being generated, because we need to coordinate across work groups. There's a number of topics and a number of thorny issues, important issues that will need to be discussed, and I can anticipate that different work groups might be touching upon the same types of topics that could be conflated, conflicted, confused, or synergized depending on how they're coordinated. So we need to know what that information is at the project management team so we can coordinate that effort. And at the same time, we also need to be careful because of these thorny issues or tricky issues that might come up as we're exploring this and seeing what's feasible and what's not. We're also going to be having a 7 state and federal government negotiation regarding reexamination of the 07 guidelines. Now, I've heard there are no secrets on the river, and I 100% agree to an extent that is true. However, we also do need to have an approach and a strategy and an effort in how we're going to meaningfully negotiate with the other states on 07 guidelines renegotiation or other things. So we need to know what the information is that's going to be distributed and disclosed to the public so that we can prepare and strategize for that. That's why we have ground rules, and that's why we have a disclosure agreement, so we can plan and prepare how the information is coming out so we're not caught blindsided. To that end, the process is going to be keeping the facilitators busy. The facilitators, I think, are going to be, the goal is for each meeting, the facilitator will prepare a report out to the project management team. And in that report out, they'll be able to identify the key ideas that were discussed, the information that's needed, the technology that might be needed, other things, and kind of just report out generally of the meeting and needs going forward. From that, the project management team is expected to coordinate with the facilitator to develop a summary for each work group meeting. And that summary will be shared with the work group members so that they can ensure that it's accurate and complete. And that summary will identify and outline what the subject matter of the work group discussion was. There will be no attribution, there will be no conclusions, it's just kind of an overview of what the subject matter of the discussion was. That document, when it's finalized, after the work group members have reviewed it, will be published and disclosed to everybody. And that will serve as the basis for the work group members and anybody else to have a discussion with whomever they want going forward. Now, if a work group member needs to be able to talk, you guys all have professional responsibilities and duties to your bosses, your boards, your clients, your oversight committees, and we're not trying to preclude you from doing your jobs. So to the extent you need to discuss something that's been going on in the work group meeting where this disclosure agreement allows for that, so long as the information shared and the discussion can remain confidential until we've produced it in a public way. If that's not suitable enough for everybody, then we ask that the work group member approach the project management team and we try to find a path forward that's useful for everybody so that we are aware and prepared for how the information is framed so we can manage the process in an efficient way. The goal is, as I say, not to hide things or only steer them in certain directions, but we need to balance between the need for utmost transparency to have a useful investigation and the need to prepare for protect our interests going forward within future interstate negotiations and with the federal government.
Right. So as we've all pointed out in one way or another, the work groups and the work that you all are doing is one part of a much bigger picture. As these work groups are meeting and having their ongoing sessions, and you guys are hashing out some of these ideas and concepts and starting to answer these or frame these threshold issues and concepts, we're going to be working with the other upper basin partners. Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico are doing a similar process within their own state borders. So we're going to keep informed of what they're looking at and some of the issues that they're identifying. We're going to be holding a series of public workshops. I don't think I mentioned the first time. Our first workshop is going to be held in conjunction with Water Congress's summer conference in Steamboat. On August 22nd, we'll be having a workshop that afternoon. And that's going to be the first of 4 workshops we'll have between now and June of next year. And as I mentioned, we're going to keep using the trustee machine that we already have, the Basin Roundtables, the Interbasin Compact Committee, meeting one-on-one and individually with the different water policy boards around the state. And also with Colorado Water Congress. So all the usual venues you've heard us speak at, or you've heard discussions about demand management, we're going to keep visiting all those. And just to point out one more time, no one thinks this process is going to be done by June of 2020. We're not going to have an answer to demand management by then. But what we're going to do is our team and with all of you are going to start answering or trying to frame some of those issues and get a few feet down the path of whether or not demand management is a good idea. And then Amy put a picture of Buzz Lightyear on the slide for some reason. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move to the Q&A portion of the webinar. And thanks to Doug Kemper from Water Congress and Michelle Garrison from CWCB They're going to moderate some of these questions for us. And as you all put questions into the chat box, they're going to relay those our way, and we're going to answer them as best we can. On Water Congress. If you haven't filled out the doodle poll, please do so ASAP. We'd like to get everyone scheduled, and what we're going to do is each facilitator is going to be looking at that doodle poll to see what times work best for folks. You may get some individual calls saying, you know, this was the best day, but you're the only person who couldn't make it that day. Is there any way you can move your plans around? And we're going to try to schedule them to where they're geographically sort of centered for the amount of people you have in your work group. So I would anticipate a lot of meetings in kind of the I-70 corridor, maybe Salida, just trying to get everyone to one place with minimal disruption to your schedule as possible. You guys find a question?
Yes. Please provide a brief description of each work group's roles and responsibilities.
My goodness. I guess, okay.
Say what the question was.
All right, so the question was, please provide a brief overview of each work group's roles and responsibilities. I would point you to the 2019 work plan that was approved by the board back in March. The document itself is on the front page of the CWCB website, and it has a couple of paragraphs or a couple of lines apiece on what each work group is going to be kind of focusing on. Something else that's going to come out pretty soon is some more information from our office just on individual work groups and what their role is. So we'll have that coming to you pretty soon. And it'll also be posted on the CWCB website. But this is all kind of being drawn most heavily from the 2019 work plan the board approved in March.
And the work groups we have right now are law and policy, monitoring and verification, accounting and administration, environmental, agricultural impact, economic considerations, funding, which are different than the economic considerations, and the tribal work groups. And outreach and education, which is important as well. So as Brent said, that the summary and the work plan identifies what each work group will kind of be focusing on, and we recognize that there could easily be some crossover between the two or among many, and so we will be trying to coordinate that but we also want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to identify what they think are the most important threshold issues within their work group, and then we will do the crossovers to the extent we need to.
One note to the participants, as you're putting in things in the chat, there's a couple options there. If you look on whether or not you're sending it privately or to everyone, so send those to everyone if you would. Okay, we've got a couple more that did come in privately, so let's pick those up.
All right.
Given Karen's recitation of approvals required before any demand management program could be implemented and all the other hurdles involved, what is the earliest the state believes a demand management program could be implemented or initiated?
All right.
Chris Treese.
So just to rephrase the question a little bit, when is the earliest we think, given all the hurdles and the red tape that we described, when the state believes a demand management program can be implemented? And I think the honest answer is that we do not know. Karen laid down all the different hurdles that we have there. We're trying to get a couple of feet down the path just on an assessment of feasibility just in this fiscal year. And I think I've said this a couple of times, for us to have a demand management program that our board gives a thumbs up to and says, this is something that we're going to pursue and pursue implementation of, we have to have really good, well-rounded answers to all the questions that are being asked about demand management. And it can't be something that just lives in a legal memo or something that our board understands but no one else does. Demand management has to work in the state because of the model we're following, the voluntary temporary compensated model. Something that everyone from the CEO of Denver Water to a rancher in Meeker can look at this and say, okay, I understand this, and I see how they try to protect my interests and make sure I wasn't going to be harmed by the implementation of this program. Not everyone's going to agree all the time with conclusions that are reached, but everyone has to understand, I think, that the project management team and the Water Conservation Board have at least taken a hard look and worked on this issue to a certain extent. So I wish I had a better timeline for you, Chris, and for my own peace of mind, I wish I had a better timeline, but it's going to be kind of iterative, I think. And when we get to the June timeline, where the work of the 2019 work plan is kind of wrapping up, I think a lot of that is going to lie on the members of the Water Conservation Board and the staff of the project management team to plot the course forward. You know, say how much were we able to accomplish this year? What have we figured out a good investigative mechanism for? What issues have we solved, or what issues have actually grown more complex as we've gone through this process? So as the Water Conservation Board adaptively manages this investigation, I think every year we'll get either a little closer or a little farther away.
I would also add to that, and 100% agree, deadlines have a tendency to help fine tune how we're going to land something or decide something. And it could be deciding that we don't do demand management as much as it could be deciding that we do. And deadlines in the Colorado River Basin, I think, have been driven more by hydrology than anything else. And so I would just put that on as an overlay of it, of the taking your foot off the gas pedal or on the gas pedal sometimes gets driven by that as well.
Right.
It doesn't answer the question though, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well, many of us spend a lot of time rephrasing Chris Treese's question. Next question I have is from Aaron Derwinson. The System Conservation Pilot Program demonstrated the value of doing work on the ground in advancing our understanding. Do you anticipate some sort of, quote, learning by doing, unquote, approach to further assessing demand management feasibility? Can we read that again?
Got it. Yeah. So from Aaron Derwinson, basically, do you see a future iteration answering different questions, perhaps, of the System Conservation Pilot Program? Everyone at the table can kick me on this one, but I think a lot of the questions that demand management raises, and the only way to answer some of those is going to be through on-the-ground experimentation, technical, legal, and policy analysis of the different questions that are raised. So I would say short answer, yes. Too long, didn't read. We're probably going to have to figure something out like that.
And I think we're built up for that in some way with the concept of anticipating that the work groups some of them will at least be wanting to contract with the subcontractor so that they can help investigate a specific threshold question and to help frame it better and identify what the boundaries of that would be. So I anticipate on the ground testing as well. Thank you.
Okay, the next question is from David G. Is there opportunity to use other reservoirs besides Lake Powell for demand management storage? That is a multi-part thing. How would demand management in Colorado, open pairing, and potentially Wyoming, closed pairing, be integrated with coordinated ops from Navajo, Aspinall Unit, Flaming Gorge for upstream demand management? Lastly, is there potential for second-tier CRSPA reservoirs to be used for demand management coordination?
So,
fees over Jack Ridge Way.
So the gist of the question is there an opportunity to use more than the initial units from the CRISPAC? So more than Blue Mesa, Aspinall, Flaming Gorge, Navajo, and Lake Powell to be able to be incorporated into the demand management program and use other reservoirs as well? There's two answers. There's a two-part answer to that question, I think. And the answer is kinda, well, no and yes, so kinda. In the fact that the demand management storage agreement that has been blessed by the federal government and signed by the parties limits the use of the reservoirs for conserved water under a demand management program to the initial units. Not just Lake Powell, but the big units in each under the CRISP Act in each of the states. So Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, Navajo, and Lake Powell. It does, so stop, period. That's what it says, and that's what we can do. That's what we could get agreement on with everybody to be able to get those documents finalized. However, how we set up a demand management program to get that conserved water to those initial units or the initial unit that we think it needs to go to is a question that we're all willing to entertain and investigate and look at. So how can we synergize or most efficiently use the existing infrastructure that we have to be able to have a demand management program is a question of interest to all of us. And I don't think it would be prudent or good to close the door and say, nope, we can't use any of the other infrastructure. I don't know how, I don't know when, and I don't know under what capacity, but that's what we're going to have the work groups kind of identify and brainstorm and see what we can look at.
And just as an aside to that, we've been in pretty close contact with the Western Colorado area office, and they have definitely demonstrated their willingness to be a part of this process. They were curious about the work groups and how these were going to function. And we've assured them several times that as the work groups identify potential solutions or issues around, using federal facilities to make demand management happen, that we'd be bringing them into the conversation as it goes along. So there's a good, pretty two-way street of communication there.
And I think the question also asked about how Wyoming reservoirs and Colorado reservoirs would be linked to Navajo, and how we would work all of those things together. I think that's part of the discussion as well, of how to make the best use of this. But the concept is that we're ultimately trying to maintain compact compliance at Lee Ferry. So if we are storing water, say in Flaming Gorge or Blue Mesa under a demand management program, ultimately we're going to be trying to have that bucket be protecting our ability to meet the 75 million acre feet and 10 at Lee Ferry. So that's what we need to investigate as part of the feasibility. Is that feasible? How should we do it in a best way for us? So I think whether it be not, and I will say that it is for the authorization for demand management, the use of storage space at the initial units is for the unused storage space. We're not talking about releasing contracted water from Navajo or Flaming Gorge or Blue Mesa to shore up our compact compliance. That water is already taken and used and slotted for something. We're talking about using unused storage space that's available and conserving water and having some place to store it, as opposed to losing it to the lower basin until we can have compact compliance. Are there any other questions?
Yes,
Okay.
I believe this is from Jim Pokran, Jim P. Legal question: if an entity has to go into executive session to hear an employee or board member's demand management work group updates, and that is challenged by the public or press, what do you advise?
I think that part of the disclosure agreement is that if anybody is getting an open meetings law or open records request, that they notify the project management team, and we work through that process together. We are definitely not asking anybody to subvert or go around the confines of a limited executive session to the way that they interpret it and the way they apply it. But I don't anticipate that we're also suggesting that you're on your own and you have to do it your way, and good luck. We will be working out all of those opportunities with you. And at the same time, I think a key element to highlight in the disclosure agreement is that it's not the only way to have a discussion. First of all, there will be elements that are open to discussion based off of the summary reports. And secondly, if that is not good enough for anybody or under one, for whatever reason, then they can bring it to the project management team, and we can figure out a way to get the information that is key that everybody's wanting to talk about in a way that we can all get it out to the people at the time demand.
Okay, next question is from Ed Millard.
Actually, can we go to Sean's next, because it
Sure.
ties in?
Oh,
And then come back.
Okay,
to that.
from Sean Cronin, sorry, Sean. Was there thought to adding language in the disclosure agreement that work group members' comments/input during meetings will/cannot be viewed as being held by their employer or client?
Well, I think, yes, there is. I think the concept is spelled out in the disclosure agreement and in some of the work group materials that we'll be having, is that we're not seeking, by having a member of, I think Sean's part of, having a member of the Front Range Water Council, for example, be on a work group doesn't mean that they're speaking on behalf of the Front Range Water Council. They're speaking by providing input as a subject matter expert. They're providing value as an individual in that capacity. Same with the River District, same with a rancher in Meeker, same with Southwestern or tribal capacity. We will have opportunities for the entities, groups, organizations to be able to take positions, make their impressions known, their opinions known in workshops and in board meetings and in other public meetings. We're not wiping that part out. That this is not a step that is replacing that. So the work group members are individuals who have subject matter expertise that can help us frame the issues as framed, as Brent indicated, to have a larger table, to have a discussion, to be able to identify what the issues are. The disclosure agreement pays nod to that in the fact that any of the information that is generated will not have attribution to any person or entity, for that matter, in what they're talking about. It's so we can have frank discussions and brainstorm outside the box, and somebody who's normally going to stay within the confines of thinking about things. We need everybody to think more globally, so we want to make sure that they're not attributed with a specific thought or idea going forward.
And I would kind of analogize it to, during the water plan process, we had a series of baseline implementation plans which informed the water plan and some of the chapters, goals, and measurable objectives. But those were done pretty much by consensus of the roundtables. And it may have been that one individual member of the roundtable was okay with this being in the BIP, but their water district or their conservation district had to take a position opposing it or interpreting it in a different way. That's okay. And I think that, as Karen mentioned, we're going to keep meeting with the water policy boards. We're going to keep meeting with the different organizations that we meet with one-on-one. And people are going to have plenty of opportunity to comment publicly in their entity's capacity as all materials about demand management come out.
To the Ed Miller.
Okay. Now we'll go to Ed Millard. Which work group will be working on proportionality? How will proportionality be enforced?
Yeah, first and foremost, I think proportionality is one of those issues that we mentioned earlier that definitely cuts across multiple work groups. We have that language in the policy statement, and the way that we're going to investigate demand management is going to be trying to avoid those negative disproportionate impacts, any water use or basin. I think how you enforce it is an entirely different question, because we're looking at a program that's voluntary, temporary, and compensated. And this is a conversation that Karen and I have way too often is, every word in that statement from the policy statement disproportionately, negatively impacted. Like there's a million different interpretations of each one of those. And I think that's going to be a discussion point for every work group, as well as some of the water policy boards and entities like the Basin Roundtables and the IBCC to sort of chip in their point of view of how that looks and what sort of guidelines and signposts can be put on a path that is leading to potential negative disproportionate impacts.
So I've got a private one that actually is going to go with this one. So first, one from Laura Chartrand, and then before we answer it, go ahead and read Ann Castle's as well, because they're very similar. The one from Laura Chartrand asks, what interaction, if any, will Colorado's commissioner have with the work groups and or recommendations made through the work group process? And then if I can read Ann Castle's.
I'll read that. Can you guys repeat the question?
Sure. The question that Michelle brought up was, what interaction will the work groups have with Colorado's commissioner to the UCRC? And what was the last part?
And then if you could read Ann Castle's,
Okay.
it has a very similar.
Sure. Go ahead and read Ann's, and we'll try to do
Okay.
all these at once.
Okay. Some of the policy issues around demand management are completely interrelated with and dependent on how upper basin issues are dealt with in connection with the renegotiation of the 2007 guidelines. Can there be interaction and discussion with work groups about the ongoing renegotiation?
Sure. I'll take the first whack, and everyone can kick me under this black table if they don't like what I'm saying. So as we kind of indicated in the previous slide, we will be bringing Colorado's commissioner in to the extent that some of the issues and concepts that the work groups identify have interstate implications, which a lot of them will. I think that as Karen and Amy and Lane laid out, you have parallel processes going on here. You have this intrastate investigation within Colorado. You have 3 other intrastate investigations going on with the other upper basin states. And then you have the work the UCRC is going to be doing to kind of see how some of this work can cross state lines. All of these processes, and this is going to be very difficult, have to inform each other to a certain extent, because some of the answers, the questions are going to be asked in other forums, and some of the answers are going to come up in these other forums. And I think, we're kind of drawing a box around, we're investigating demand management today. We're not investigating how the guidelines can be renegotiated. We're not looking at policy statements as to what happens after 2026. But as Ann Castle points out, they are extremely interrelated. So I think while we're trying to draw a box around this discussion to demand management, it's going to be the onus on the project management team, on the different facilitators, to make sure that the work groups are informed as those discussions unfold, and how those interstate discussions could implicate the work that the work groups are doing. So it's going to be a big mess of over communication, if I was trying to phrase it up.
And I think to build on that is the notion that the Upper Colorado River Commission is definitely embarking on its own process for looking at demand management, because it has to look at interstate, how the states are going to bleed together and work together to have a full-on program. We've been very careful to make sure that, or we will continue to make very careful that the commission's not driving our investigation in a way that we are not comfortable with, or driving it at all. We're going to be driving what our investigation is and having that bleed into and inform the commission's investigation. And there will be an iterative process. We might have to adapt a little bit based on what we hear from Wyoming and New Mexico and Utah and the federal government. But they also will have to bend a little bit to us from what we're finding out. So there's going to be a lot of communication having to go that way, but we want to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts or asking questions in ways that are going to contradict each other, at least unknowingly, and so that we can figure that out. And again, we'll also on another path be renegotiating or re-examining the 07 guidelines, which will be a process and not just happening overnight either, but our investigations will help inform that process as well. And so I think the commissioner and the commission, even the executive director of the commission and everybody might be brought in at times to help us understand what's going on, and we can have a better ability to inform the work groups of what's going on going forward.
And just to repeat everything Karen just said, the UCRC is the 4 states. And I think that there's been a recognition at the commissioner's level, at the UCRC's committee's level, that this work has to be led by what makes sense within the borders of each of their member states. So it makes sense that Colorado, having the diversity of water use and water users that we have, and the proportion of water under the Upper Colorado River Basin Compact that we have to be a leader in the Upper Basin on this. And we have the means, our board has given us the direction, and we have the involvement from people like you on these work groups to really take that leadership role. And I think that we're excited about it. We're a little nervous about it. But we're happy to be doing this process and the complexities that it brings up, because we have to be that leader in the Upper Basin.
Okay, next question is from Steve Riddell. What was the thinking behind adding local governments to the economic considerations work group? This could be added to the titles of several of the work groups.
So why did we add local government to the economic considerations work group? Question from Steve. This was at the direction of our board. The economic considerations work group is going to be looking at a series of different impacts, both challenges and opportunities that demand management represents. And I think that we put local government in with economic considerations because we're going to be looking at the impacts of a potential program, at the municipal, county, regional level, as well as statewide. So we thought that bringing in some folks who work in the local government would be the best people to sort of analyze how demand management could be impacting local communities. So when you have people who are county commissioners, when you have people who work for municipalities on both the east or western slope, there may be a little bit separate from the usual water bubble, but they also are going to have very valuable input as to what the actual on-the-ground impacts are going to be that maybe the 5 of us up here wouldn't have for these different regions of the state.
Okay, another one from Ed Millard. Will IBCC receive detailed briefings on work group appointment progress, or will it be only through the workshops? Does IBCC have a decision-making role in this process? Sure.
So the IBCC, as I mentioned a couple of times, is one of the public forums that we're going to be engaging with very regularly and in detail throughout this process. This is one of those bedrocks of the Colorado public input process that was set up by House Bill 1177. So it's something that we always work with the Water Conservation Board and the IBCC hand in hand. So we have a meeting coming up Thursday, Wednesday and Thursday, where we're going to do a joint briefing to the Water Conservation Board and the Interbasin Compact Committee about progress so far on how the work groups have been populated, what's happening on this webinar today, and some of the meetings that we see evolving through the rest of the summertime. So the IBCC will be getting detailed briefings. The IBCC, as you all may be familiar, is very self-directed. The membership and the issues that are referred to them by their different basin roundtables, pick on the issues where the IBCC thinks they can add value. And we've heard a demonstrated commitment from the IBCC membership and from the roundtables to really grapple with some of these issues around demand management that make sense for a body like the Interbasin Compact Committee. If you look to specific paragraphs in the conceptual framework in Chapter 8 of the Water Plan, you'll see that in the very beginning stages of talking about demand management, which at that time was called a collaborative program, you'll see the IBCC really called out its own role there. They talk about how the IBCC is an appropriate role for bringing back to sort of a statewide conversation the different viewpoints about demand management around the state and the different viewpoints articulated at the Basin Roundtables. You see the IBCC being tapped or tapping themselves with the role of scoping these different technical analyses and as issues come in from the interstate level, for them to review them and take the information back to the Basin Roundtable so that people understand what's happening at an upper basin level. So the short answer is yes, IBCC will get briefings, and the decision-making role of the IBCC and the advisory role that the IBCC plays to the Water Conservation Board, I think is going to be very important to this entire process.
More, if I can have a little more depth on that from Alex Davis. What will the role of the Basin Roundtables be?
And just to beef up our own cool public process, once again, the Basin Roundtables are where the real discussion on the ground happens. And while the work groups are going to help us articulate some of these issues for public discussion and start to propose a few investigative methods to which we can get to the answers of some of these tough questions, the Basin Roundtables are where things in Colorado water policy get ground truthed. You know, the work groups can come up with a way that an issue is identified, and the Water Conservation Board and our project management team can say, here's what we think the first big 3 issues are with the funding of a demand management program. But when we go to the Gunnison Roundtable, the Metro Roundtable, the South Platte Roundtable, these are the guys who say, those 3 issues are great, but you're also leaving out X. So it's a ground truthing portion, and I think that the Basin Roundtables have to be brought along with every step of demand management. I mentioned earlier there has to be a statewide comfort level with what we're investigating and how we're doing it. And the roundtables are where we do that roadshow. We come visiting everyone in their hometown and we say, here's what our board has done so far with the policy statements. Here's what our board is proposing with the work plan. Let us know what we're leaving out. Let us know what considerations or concerns that we are not addressing head on or inaccurately. So the roundtables are going to continue to be that input forum. I know that some of the West Slope roundtables have formed a DCP and demand management subcommittee that are playing different roles, not only putting forth some concepts they think are very important to be considered in demand management, but also playing a very important educational and outreach role to the different constituents of a Basin Roundtable about what demand management is. And I think really doing a fantastic job of getting the word out about the different DCP demand management processes as they've evolved.
I'm not seeing any, one just came in. Ed Millard, another question. We now have 3 questions. I don't know if we have a question limit.
Oh no, we know that.
If IBCC and roundtables say demand management is not right for our basins, will that matter?
Absolutely. Like this is demand management, and the way that we're investigating it is voluntary. It's not something that's going to happen. The way that it's being investigated is not something that's being forced from top down. The way we're investigating it is not to force people to participate in demand management as contemplated. And I think that, as I've mentioned, this sort of statewide comfort level has to exist before the Water Conservation Board is going to say yes to demand management.
It'll definitely inform the CWCBs.
Absolutely.
In line here. And from Alex Davis, who will mediate if the Basin Roundtables deeply disagree?
I think this is a role that the IBCC plays as far as bringing issues that are of concern to the Basin Roundtables to a more statewide discussion forum. The IBCC is sort of serving that role as a think tank and to sort of knead out some of those disagreements between basins. As Russ George mentioned at the West Slope Basin Roundtable Summit, you know, the IBCC, as he saw it, was a place where when Basin Roundtables identified an issue, they wanted to be elevated to a different level to a more statewide level to discuss with their partners in neighboring basins. That's what the IBCC was intended to do. And I think the IBCC is a good place to lead this up. And then also the Water Conservation Board. You know, it's a representation on the CWCB is by basin. And I think that the eager participation that our board members have within their basin roundtable gives them a certain level of familiarity with the issues, what they may be, what some of the answers may be. And our board is a good place to have a discussion as well.
Yeah, I think ultimately the roundtables and the IBCC will be able to have the discussions and identify and do some of the ground truthing that Brent had identified, and the information that's generated from that, or whether there be lines drawn in the sand or not, will be hugely informative to the CWCB and how they decide going forward.
Absolutely.
Okay, not sure this is from SJWIP. What is the vision for the first regional workshop at Steamboat? Do you have an agenda put together for that?
We don't have an agenda yet. The way the regional workshops are going to go, it's an opportunity for people who live in that region to come and talk about some of the concerns, opportunities, and challenges they may identify with demand management. So I think there's going to be a portion of that is just kind of like this, a Q&A / public comment period where the project management team is going to be recording this for consideration by the work groups and for the Water Conservation Board. I also think the regional workshops are intended to be a report out on our work plan so far. So while it will probably start off with some of the more introductory what is demand management type presentation, we'll keep that pretty brief, kind of like we did today. And I think that then we'll dive into how the work groups were formed, what the work groups are doing, and to the extent by that point we have some summaries of the first work group meetings. And again, this is all contingent on doodle polls and people driving there over the next month. We'll be able to report out at that level onto what the work groups are looking at.
And if there's something to report out on the Upper Colorado River Basin level, or just implementation of the DCP level, all of those kind of things, we can report out on that as well. And we're happy to report out on other things we haven't thought of if the question's raised.
And that's going to be, put my plug in, that's going to be on August the 22nd and at the Steamboat Grand. And that's open to the public, right? That's so.
Yep. It's intended for that specific.
All right. And then Brent's doing a session right before the end of the late morning that same day on river operations. And stuff. That'll be good too. All right. Another one bringing in from the Reeder Creek Ranch. Will you please summarize the status of the Upper Basin states in their investigation process relative to demand management?
Sure. Just like the other Upper Basin states, their progress and their individual processes for investigating demand management vary. So I think that, as I mentioned earlier, just because of our diversity of water users and the will of our board, we've really kind of grabbed this bull by the horns, and we've been trying to come up with this comprehensive process that works and trying our hardest at it. The other states are in varying stages of that. We had a workshop a couple weeks ago in Salt Lake City where we got to hear what the other states are working on. And some of them are forming some task groups. Some of them are utilizing existing stakeholder forum infrastructure, kind of like we are with the IBCC and the roundtables. They have some water advisory committees in Wyoming, in Utah, and in New Mexico that they're engaging with. I know in New Mexico, they, just because of the extent of tribal water use there, they're working really closely with their tribes, as we are. So it's a lot of outreach, and I think what is demand management and how would it affect you at this point in the other Upper Basin states as well. I'm not bragging, but I think we're a little further down the path by forming the work groups and scheduling workshops. And they are.
I would also say that I know that Wyoming has contracted with specific people from the University of Wyoming to create a process for investigating this in their state, and doing a whole outreach effort and investigating the threshold issues and going from there. But they've hired a committee from the University of Wyoming to facilitate that process. So nobody's investigated anything yet. They're just starting.
So we're like way ahead.
We're way ahead of the curve.
We're way ahead as usual.
You guys are killing me.
Becky, I'm not seeing any other questions. Michelle, how about you? You okay? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything else.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you all for attending. This will be available on our homepage and our YouTube page that CWCB has. And again, thank you. We look forward to continued participation.
I'd also say that just because you haven't thought of a question now, there might be one later, and you can use the demand management website, or I think a lot of you guys have our web or our email addresses, and it's on the slides as well, and you can reach out to us, and we can try to make sure if there's frequently asked questions that we're updating that and making sure that everybody has the answers.
I would just say one last plug to please fill out your doodle polls if you haven't, so we can get these meetings on the books for the next month or so.
Thank you, guys.
And from the Water Congress, thanks again for participating and hanging in there with, this is a kind of temporary technology here. We're in our new conference room, but we haven't yet ordered the equipment that's really going to be our video conferencing equipment. So we're really excited about that. And so you're on kind of a temporary setup with wires going everywhere. You know,
Well,
so-
thanks for letting us be your guinea pigs.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for everybody out there. So at peak, we had 109 on, so
Okay.
good crowd. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Oh,